the recording. Great. Great. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jane Beaman, and I'm really honored to co-organize this symposium with Ben and Karita, and also have the honor of moderating and presiding over the next couple of sessions. So first, we're going to have Benzo Xueqia Zhang and Lingxiao Chen, apologies for mispronouncing your name, how to say Black Lives Matter in Chinese, debates in a transnational public sphere. And I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order of the names I just said. So first, Ben is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology at Emory University. His research interests are situated in the intersection between politics and culture, broadly defined, with a regional focus on East Asia, especially China, and with a global and comparative perspective. His ultimate intellectual goal is twofold. One, to develop generalizable knowledge without sacrificing sensitivity to context-specific processes and local knowledge. And two, to address important public issues without losing scientific rigor and intellectual depth. His new book, The Culture of Democracy, A Sociological Approach to Civil Society, came out in the UK and the US, published with Polity. And his second book, Chairman Mao's Children, Generation and the Politics of Memory in China by Cambridge University Press, was published in 2021 in hardback and ebook. It was awarded by Choice Reviews as one of the 5 outstanding academic titles about China in 2022. Xinhua Zhang, apologies if I mispronounced your name, is a second-year PhD student in sociology at Emory University. Her current research addresses the ethical dilemma faced by Chinese journalists. She holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in sociology awarded by Peking University. And finally, Lingxiao Chen is a second-year sociology PhD student, also at Emory University, specializing in nationalism and propaganda and also authoritarian context, Her current research focuses on the impact of Chinese celebrities' nationalistic actions on their public perception in China. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Hong Kong in 2021. So we'll proceed the same way we did with the earlier panels, 20 minutes presentation, and then a subsequent Q&A. So thank you, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jing. And so our project is to address the public discourses and debates over the Black Lives Matter movement in China. So this is a project I'm working on with 2 of my great graduate students, Lingxiao and Xueqia. I believe I pronounced their name correctly. So, so this debate is by far the largest debate in China over race-related issue in another country. And it involves various types of platforms and participants in the state media and so on and so forth. And also it happens inside and outside China, and more importantly, in between, because some of the platforms are between China and outside world. And what is significant here, as our title has already indicated, how to say in Chinese, the Black Lives Matter, that is about the issue of translation, mistranslation, and also political stance. For example, some of you probably know this, that is, there's one translation that is, if we do a direct retranslation into English, that is basically the Black Lives Also Matter, which is quite close to the original meaning. The other one distorts the original meaning. If we retranslate it into English, could be Black lives are more precious than others, which is certainly is to show a sort of a superiority of Black lives. So you can see this this kind of translation issue is also one of the cases of conflicts and paradoxes and so on and so forth. So this debate is quite significant for us to understand Chinese society now. So it is also, this case also is theoretically important because it addresses a theoretical issue that is transnational public discourses, which has a sizable literature in the recent years. But there are several questions have not been adequately addressed in this literature. That is, first, how is democracy discussed in transnational discourses? We all know in the classical theory of public sphere, in Habermas, for example, the public discourses in the public sphere are believed to be the foundation of democracy, but that's within the nation state constraints. And then what about the transnational discourses, which cut across different nation states? In what way can we talk about democracy? So that's a significant issue to address. And second is, how is race discussed in transnational discourses, which again have not been addressed very adequately in the theoretical literature. And third question is, how does the state's involvement in global public sphere shape the discourses of democracy and race? The Chinese debate over Black Lives Matter movement is a good case because the discourses are really about democracy and race in a transnational context. And also, apparently, Chinese state is a strong authoritarian state. Its shaping power over the public spheres are well known, but we don't know for sure the specific details about how actually the state shapes the discourses. And also, this debate is happening in a social context where the popular views regard democracy and the race as relevant or even non-existent in China. So why this debate actually happened in China, and also with such a scale, this is also a very interesting question for us to explore. So our research is based on an approach that is the cultural sociology of the public sphere. So we empirically examine public discourses in a social political context instead of using normative ideas to replace empirical studies. So it's a completely empirical study, and to examine how people use normative ideas and in different ways, and also the conflicts among several normative ideas. More specifically, we examine a few things. For example, we look at patterns of narratives and comments. Narratives means the longer pieces, longer texts, which actually present ideas in a way that is, the whole text looks like a narrative and looks like a story. And the comments means the brief expression of opinions. And also we look at how the patterns of narratives and the comments vary in different publics. Publics here means the social space based on media types and also topics. So when we are talking about the public sphere, we are not looking at a homogeneous space, but it's a space with lots of fragments, and publics is the way to theorize the fragmentation feature of the public sphere. We are also looking at different modes of the state's involvement in different ways. For example, intervention, which means that the state actually creates the narratives and discourses and directly participated in the discourses. Or we look at a restriction, which usually is, identified as a censorship. In other words, restricting some of the discourses, that's a restriction. And also we look at the participants of the public, their transnational experience in different ways. For example, whether they consider themselves as spectators of an issue that happened in another national context, or they can believe themselves as members of the society where this issue happens. So how actually their transnational experience shapes their understanding and also discourses about the issue. And more deeply, we look at their horizon of interpretation, which is a term from hermeneutics. Basically, you can understand, certainly is a very simplistic understanding, understand as the background information and background knowledge or discourses about certain issues. For example, in this case, we look at how democracy and race are talked about in previous cases. For example, in the democracy is not a forbidden term in China, in contrast to many of the so-called conventional wisdom. Democracy is one of the socialist core values, and it appears in the official narratives. And race is also a term that is actually usually forgotten in the Chinese context. And some people believe that race is an issue that is foreign to China. And this actually includes official discourses and popular discourses. But racism is a big issue actually in China, which is usually ignored by the public discourses. You have official institutional racism, which put restrictions on immigration and so on and so forth, and also implicit racism in official discourses. But official discourses, rarely say that very explicitly. But explicit popular racism actually exists in many public discourses. So these are the horizons of the interpretations, how actually they're translated and realized into this particular case of a discourses of Black Lives Matter is something that we try to look at. So we collect a lot of data. We collect data from 4 publics, including almost 400 articles from the traditional media, which includes the core state media, such as Renminbi, the People's Daily, and non-state media. And also we collected more than 1,000 posts from WeChat or Weixin in Chinese and public accounts. So public accounts are more like, longer blogs, which are quite popular in China. And also we collect more than 200 posts from Weibo. Weibo is a microblogging website in China, similar to Twitter, but certainly subject to the censorship of the state. And also we collect more than 400 tweets from Twitter. And in total, we have more than 2,000 texts. And then we code these data through 2 ways. One way is to look at the longer pieces with relatively complete narrative structures, and by using Kenneth Burke's pentad analysis, which actually includes 5 key components of narratives, such as the agent, which is the actor, and agency, which is a prop or tool, and action, and also scene and purpose. So we look at the structure of the text and also the intended meaning of the text. And for comments, we use the civil sphere theory by Jeffrey Alexander, and we look at how actually they talked about the issue and also what kind of codes they use implicitly and explicitly in their discussions. So here's what our findings. So in the traditional media public, in which the state's intervention and also state's restriction are both very strong, and then we can see the dominance of state discourses there, which actually account for almost like how much is that? Almost like a 30%, more than 30% of the total patterns that is about the hypocritical American democracy. So this pattern goes like this: American politicians or the American state in general, which is agent, passively or violently responded, which is act, to the Black Lives Matter movement with discriminatory policies and rhetoric, which is agency, that is the tool or props, for their own personal and regime's political interests instead of a racial justice. That is the purpose, against the backdrop of the COVID crisis, political polarization, and the US-China geopolitical tensions. That's the scene. So the purpose of this kind of pattern is to show that, American democracy is pseudo, is hypocritical, and the Chinese democracy is much better. So that's the traditional media public. In the WeChat public, in which the state's intervention was weak, in other words, the state actually did not actively create lots of narratives and discourses. Certainly you'll find the WeChat public accounts of the state media, but they're insignificant compared to tons of other public accounts. But the restrictions were still strong because the state imposed quite a lot of censorship on the WeChat public. So the state's official narrative of Black Lives Matter was on the margins. What is more interesting is that this kind of a withdrawal of the state from WeChat public actually creates room for diverse narratives, including narratives that are very explicitly racist in their content and the rhetoric, and narratives that supported the Black Lives Matter movement, and then narratives that demonstrated and balanced the views, and so on and so forth. So that diversity you will not see in the traditional public. But on the other hand, you find that the dominant pattern is something that is reflecting the overseas Chinese concerns about racial tensions and safety. For example, this pattern, violence and looting, which actually is about, the fear about the violence related to the protests. It goes like this: Black Lives Matter protesters, which are actors in this pattern, committed violence and looting, which is action in various cities, which is seen, and especially in Chinese American neighborhoods, which is seen. And consequently, Chinese and Asian Americans were the main victims, which is actor, but is the passive actors. So this is more like a reflection of the overseas Chinese concerns about racial tensions and safety. What is interesting in terms of language is that the language on WeChat public is pretty sensational and also even openly racist language. And that was the one thing that you will not see in traditional media. The Twitter public, which is quite interesting as well, one thing is that the Twitter is out of the state's reach. In other words, the state intervention and also states restrictions are quite weak, if not non-existent. So as a result, democracy and race become central issues. In other words, lots of discussions about democracy, not just about American democracy, but also linking Black Lives Matter movement to Chinese political issues and also to race issues as well. But what is surprising is that most Chinese tweets are against Black Lives Matter. For example, if you can see here on the table, 83.66% of the tweets are opposing Black Lives Matter, while the supporting ones only 12%. And in the dominant patterns, Black Lives Matter movement was regarded as a threat to American democracy and a force driven by ultra-left activism. Even some of the tweets actually associated Black Lives Matter movement with the Chinese state, which actually reads more like a conspiracy theory, but that was a pretty prevalent pattern. And another thing is that in some of the high producing accounts, they actually use quite explicit racist language, which actually surprised us when we were analyzing the tweets. One thing that is important is who are the participants of the Twitter public. So we know that many of the Twitter users in Chinese language are the overseas Chinese who are residing here, who are has already migrated to the United States. And also there's another group of people who are political exiles who for Tiananmen, for other political issues, and they're already residing in the United States and elsewhere, and certainly against the Chinese government. Another group of people are self-selected people who actually use VPNs and other ways to so-called climb the Great Firewall, to bypass the censorship system and to make comments on this space. So their horizons of interpretation shows the so-called fusion of different horizons. One thing is the old horizon they actually were socialized in China, and also the new transnational horizon, which actually has the race and democracy in their mind. So that was the one thing that we look at the Twitter public. The Weibo public is somewhere in between. It is similar to WeChat than other publics, but one significant difference is that more people or more discourses on Weibo public take the discernible spectator perspective on the racial issue. That is to regard the racial issues and the Black Lives Matter movement more an American issue rather than our issue. So in other words, it's just very far from us. We just enjoy the pleasure of spectating the chaos in the United States. That kind of perspective is there. And this can be explained by the participants' less transnational experience. In other words, fewer overseas participants in Weibo than in WeChat. So we count the number of the users on Weibo who have overseas IP addresses, which is about 36 of the total number of users, and which is significantly lower compared to 87.25% of the WeChat public accounts who have overseas Chinese as target audiences. So overall, we have some conclusions. First, that the Chinese state's two modes of involvement and the restriction and intervention shape the discourses of democracy and race in different ways. Strong intervention of the state leads to predominance of the official narratives of the democracy and the race, which actually means the state directly engage in the discourses and create the discourse for the people, for the public. And weak intervention, leads to weak presence of the official narratives and more diverse views, which is pretty obvious in the WeChat public. On the other hand, weak restrictions lead to diverse views and also more explicit linking Black Lives Matter movement to American democracy and also Chinese political issues, which means that outside the state's reach, and you find that the American and Chinese political issues are linked together through the Black Lives Matter movement. And also the strong restrictions leads to lack of such link. And finally, the state did not actually impose strong restrictions on race discussions, which is quite interesting for us to explore further. So you find the popular racism actually is everywhere in the Chinese discourses over Black Lives Matter movement. And the second is more transnational experience intensifies the participants' interest in talking about democracy and race, because the two topics are more important in their host society than in China. And third is that both the state involvement and the transnational experience together and translate different horizons of interpretation into the Black Lives Matter discourses. Popular racism was intensified and pervasive in the publics where the state's restrictions on race issues are weak, which is actually generally weak. So this contradicts the prevalent imagination about the authoritarian's role in public discourses, because you hear everywhere on newspaper that the state spreads disinformation and also trying to manipulate even outside of national borders, which is actually true, but there are some nuances in there. And so our research on this aspect can correct some of the prevalent but sometimes untrue opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really informative and insightful presentation. So we have a few moments for Q&A, and so I'm going to ask people to either raise their hand who are on the panel, who are on the dais, or just what it is, or indicate their question in the Q&A. And so I see we have one question. So Michelle Christian asks, can you please provide a little bit of background on notions of quote unquote Blackness, narratives of quote unquote anti-Blackness in China historically and contemporarily? That's a great question to start us off on.
Well, I recommend some of the readings by, for example, Chen who is a professor of history and has a wonderful book about racism in China. So what happens in China, this is more like a horizon of interpretation I talked about, is that people believe that race is not a China issue, is a foreign issue. So racism, if you ask a Chinese on the street, and this person would say, oh, no, there's no racism in China. That's a completely Western issue. The race doesn't exist in China. But racism is everywhere. So Blackness based on skin color, it's something that is taken for granted and not only in the institutional racism that is the state. For example, some of the policies about the African immigrants in Guangdong province, and there are wonderful anthropological studies about their conundrums and also their difficulties and become part of China, and how they hostile policies, which actually do not have the official rhetorics, but it's very racist in this feature. But popular racism is completely based on skin color, and also it's that the dark skin was believed to be inferior to the light skin, and some of you probably know that there was a pretty tasteless advertisement. There's a black guy actually put it into a washing machine, and then it turns out that there's a Chinese pale skin guy actually came out. So that kind of thing. Oh, this washing machine actually works so good. So that was the one sort of indications of this popular racism. So racism in China sometimes also, as I said, that it's popular racism, sometimes it could be very explicit. And while the institutional racism is more implicit, but it is there in the policies.
Thank you. So another question in the Q&A box. Amazing presentation. My question is related to what you just said about race not seen as a Chinese issue. Did some of the discourses you analyzed link race and discrimination in China against minorities in the country at all?
Oh, that's a good question. We expected that, but actually, no. Not many. I would say like zero. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lingxiao and Xueqia. Zero, it actually link the Black Lives Matter movement to ethnic minorities groups in China. So if you watch from outside, look at the Chinese discourses, you would expect, this thing could be linked to Uyghur people in Xinjiang, could be linked to other ethnic minority groups, which are hot button issues in outside China. But even outside China, even on Twitter, WeChat group, WeChat public accounts with the overseas Chinese as audience, and there's no discussion, obvious link between the two. So we are thinking about this. One of the reasons is that, when you think about ethnic groups in China, most Chinese will say, well, ethnic groups are still part of Chinese, while the dark-skinned people are really not Chinese, which is actually quite, has longer sort of historical reasons for that, one of which is the official narratives about ethnicity. That is, usually in the official propaganda, that is, China consists of 56 ethnic groups, which includes even includes Russian and Koreans, the ethnic groups. This is a part of Chinese, and the Blacks are not really part of Chinese. So that is sort of a rhetorical separation between the ethnicity and the race, although we know that in many other places, ethnic issue is just a race issue, and two things are intertwined each other.
Thank you. So I'm just going to read, we have two more questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to do them together in the interest of time. I also have a series of questions, but we can talk about that later. So first, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether Chinese discussions of racial inequality might have informed, or been informed by discussions of social difference within China, such as the marginalization of minority nationalities. And the second question is, thank you for sharing this fascinating research. Was the study able to identify quote unquote opinion leaders, those who are more active, more vocal, or assuming some sort of expert role on these different media platforms? If so, could you please discuss the specific roles played by the quote unquote opinion leaders? So I'll let you guys take both those questions in turn. Thank you.
I think the first question has already been answered by my previous, answer to the question about ethnic minority. So I just, if you have questions, then we can discuss later. And second question is interesting. We actually examined some of the patterns, particularly on Twitter. So let me tell you this. So the discourses about Black Lives Matter movement in simplified Chinese characters are dominated by 4 accounts. And these 4 accounts account for probably, I can't remember the exact number, but something like 70% and 60% of the, probably more, right? Lingxiao, of all the tweets. In other words, 4 people dominated the discussion of Black Lives Matter movement on Twitter. And if you look closely at these 4 people, and one of them is a pretty renowned dissident who actually fled China about 15 years ago, and then now is quite famous, or probably infamous, for their, I won't identify gender, for their ultra-conservative and even ultra-right-wing views about lots of things, including Trump and other things as well. And the other 3 are pretty much the same, like this person. So we see the opinion leaders clearly on Twitter. In other words, if you look at this sort of a distribution, and it's skewed to these 4 people. And then we delete these 4 people and take the average. And still, the dominant pattern is opposing Black Lives Matter movement. So that was skewed, but the general pattern is there opposing Black Lives Matter movement. On Weibo, it's less so because there's some opinion leaders not that dominant level. So I would say like opinion leaders certainly mattered, and they are the people, particularly outside of China, and particularly in the states restrictions are actually weaker. So you have those opinion leaders all the way to the ultra right, which is quite interesting to observe.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes. I'm going to sort of abuse my liberty as presenter to ask a question, one of many questions I have about this really fascinating presentation. So I just want to, maybe I misheard you, and so this may be an opportunity for you to clarify. I thought at some point you said that the Chinese tweets that are against Black Lives Matter, some of them have a sort of, or see Black Lives Matter as sort of a conspiracy theory or employ a bit of that framing. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Partly because that's come up a little bit in my ongoing research on some of these questions in the French context as a way of sort of dismissal of Black Lives Matter as a movement, sort of saying it's sort of, funded by George Soros, that sort of thing. So I'm just kind of curious if you could say a little bit more about how that came up in you.
Yeah, I think Lingxiao can answer this question. And so she's the one responsible for some of the conspiracy theory patterns on Twitter, which is quite interesting.
Sure. So I'll just share some of the interesting conspiracy theories real quick. One of them, the most striking one probably was how they relate the Bible, like the Bible prophecies with the Black Lives Matter. And not only did they characterize the BLM protesters as disruptive, but also vicious. They are like demonized and probably controlled, manipulated by the specter of communism. And while the Trump supporters or people who are anti-BLM right to history, so I thought that was the religious implication, the way they drew parallels was very interesting.
Another way of making this link is, they identify some of the, major activists as Marxists. Some of them are self-claimed Marxists, and then they believe that Marxism is the Marxism here is the Marxism in China. So in that way, those Marxists are connected to the Chinese state. They are the more like agents of the Chinese state. So make that link, which all the way circle back to their anti-Chinese state political stance, which is quite interesting to observe.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Just thinking about how different discourses travel internationally on both the sort of pro and anti-Black Lives Matter stances, if you will. Okay, so if there are not any other questions, thank you so much for this really thoughtful presentation. And we will move right on to the next presenter that I have the honor of introducing, Yasmin Kelike. So if you can turn your...
Hi, Pamela. Hi, Pamela, are you there?
I am. I'm trying to start my video, but it says the host has stopped it.
All right, we'll get you set up.
Okay, thank you.
And will you be sharing a screen? We can make you a co-host.
Yes, I will. I think I'm now co-host. Okay, I see this.
Yeah, she's co-host now, so yeah, let's keep that.
Okay, excellent.
Really looking forward to your presentation. I'll wait 1 minute and then introduce you.
Okay, thank you.
While we wait, you can get your screen together. Yeah.
Let me put it on. And are you able to see my screen okay? Okay, excellent.
And Pamela, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. I will send you a 5-minute heads up in the chat, so just look out for that, okay?
Thank you. That would be very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, we are back, and let's start right on time. So for our last set of papers today, we have two amazing scholars who are going to take us home with some wonderful presentations. And first up, we have Pamela Nwakanma, who is a leading edge fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies. Through this postdoctoral fellowship, she serves as the research coordinator for the project on decolonizing democracy at People Powered. She earned her PhD from the Department of Government with a secondary field in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University in 2022. And today, Pamela will be delivering a presentation from Black Lives Matter to EndSARS, Women's Socio-Political Power and the Transnational Movement for Black Lives. Thank you so much, and I cede the floor to Pamela.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Karita. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're all tuning in from. It's such a privilege to be part of this symposium. Thank you to the organizers for making this space possible. As Ben had mentioned earlier today, this is not the end of these conversations, it's actually the end of the beginning. That's the way he had phrased it. So I quite like that phrasing. So as Karita had mentioned, I have a background in political science. I got my PhD last year. And for the past year, I was working as a leading edge fellow with the American Council of Learned Societies, which is a postdoctoral fellowship that specifically targets recent PhDs who want to bridge the gap between academia and practice. And so I'm currently, I didn't actually update the organizers on this, I apologize for that. So I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University and starting as an assistant professor at UC Irvine next year. So just to give an update, because I realized I didn't give an update. Thank you. So today I will be sharing my work on comparing the women's socio-political power between the Black Lives Matter movement and the EndSARS movement. And I will be giving some context around what the EndSARS movement is for those who might not be as familiar. And so before I get started, I want to sort of situate myself in this particular project and explain my motivations for even working on this project to begin with. So it starts with 2020 for me. So in 2020, there was just a lot going on, as we all know, with the global pandemic and sort of like a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which had already started since 2013. And I remember even being involved in the Black Lives Matter protest in New York back when I lived in New York in 2015. And just seeing it resurge in 2020, given how there were even more recent deaths at the hands of police officers of Black people in the US. And I was thinking how interesting it was, not just for myself, but others who I knew were involved in the BLM movement, how we were basically gathering at a time where we were being told to socially distance, and how essentially we were risking our health and risking our lives by being on the streets and really pushing for this thing that we thought was really important. And so in that particular time, I was still a PhD student at Harvard, and I had planned to do long-term field work in Nigeria because my dissertation work is focused on gender and political behavior in the Nigerian context, thinking about political behavior across a range of different political activities, not just protest behavior, but even the idea of running for elected office, being in appointed positions, voting, being part of local community gatherings, and other forms of political behavior. And so at that time, I was stuck on campus at Harvard, and I couldn't go to Nigeria for obvious reasons. Even though I had conducted fieldwork prior, I had planned to go back in order to just continue my fieldwork, and I could not. So I was more so involved with what was happening on the ground in the US with the BLM movement in the Boston area. And at that time, I'd also seen a lot of rhetoric around the EndSARS movement in 2020. So EndSARS had already started years prior, but in 2020 in particular, there was a day called, well, Nigerians know it as Black Tuesday, which was also known as the Lekki Tollgate Massacre in Lagos State, where a number of protesters who were unarmed were protesting against sort of like the brutality of SARS, which is a particular police unit in Nigeria. And 20 protesters were shot and a number of others were also injured. And so this really sparked a lot of outrage, not just within Nigeria, but also beyond. And I will give a little bit of detail around what SARS represents, how it started, and how it continued. And so in this particular time, I was thinking about the two countries that I identify with. I am Nigerian American, and thinking about how these were both happening at the same time. And because I was already studying gender and political behavior, I already had a particular lens through which I was thinking about these two movements. And I think for me personally, just thinking about the fact that they were gaining so much more traction again in a time where we were being told to socially distance, and how this was so much more important than just thinking about our own individual health and other considerations as well. So this is the way I answer this project. And so there are a number of research questions that I tackle in the project. One of them being, what is the relationship between BLM and anti-police brutality movements abroad, such as the EndSARS movement? And in answering this question, I think about the similarities and differences between the two movements. And specifically, just to mention, this particular presentation is based upon a paper that I already have published in Perspectives on Politics, and it was part of a special issue that looks specifically at the effects of BLM abroad. And so the second main question I look at in the paper is, how have Black feminist theories of intersectionality and personal politics informed anti-police brutality movements transnationally? And the third question really speaks to my broader research agenda that looks beyond protest movements, thinking about the role of social power in political behavior. And so in this particular project and in my larger sort of like book agenda, I think about social power through the lens of politically enabling social networks. So thinking about horizontal and vertical relationships with family, friends, colleagues, peers, essentially what kinds of communities and politically active spaces are people embedded in that ends up inciting or shaping their own political awareness and their own political empowerment. And so there are two core objectives that I have in this paper and the project itself. I demonstrate how Black feminist theoretical insights on justice inform the BLM movement, which in turn also has implications for other anti-police brutality movements globally, including the EndSARS movement. And then I also advance a theory of protest behavior and more broadly political behavior through the lens of social power, particularly as it relates to the role of women in being on the front lines and forming the backbone strategies for these movements. And so to give a bit of background on EndSARS, so SARS refers to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which is a special unit as part of the police unit in Nigeria. It was created in the mid-1990s to combat armed robbery and other crimes like cyber crimes, for instance. And over time, SARS has been implicated in a number of human rights abuses related to arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial killings, unlawful detentions, extortion, roadblocks, and other heinous crimes. And so just to give you a bit of contextual context, the image that's here is from one of the protesters during the EndSARS movement. And it says on here, hashtag iPhone, laptops, styled hair, and living fresh isn't a crime. And that might not be obvious, the meaning of that, to those who are not as familiar with the Nigerian context. But just to help you understand what that means is that in Nigeria, a lot of these human rights abuses, the targets of them from SARS were young people, particularly young people who had some sort of ostentatious show of wealth. And the reason for this is that in Nigeria, there are certain concerns around cyber crimes related to fraud. And even for those who are a little bit more familiar with the US context, there's this joke called the Nigerian Prince joke, and it's referring to that, this whole idea of getting fraudulent messages or emails from someone asking, saying that you've inherited an amount of money and you send them your bank account or whatever. It can come in different forms, but it's referring to that. So these cyber crimes are very prevalent in Nigerian society, and SARS was also created to help to combat these over time. And so a lot of those who are targeted by SARS are those who are being seen as being potential Yahoo boys or being potential fraudsters who use the internet to essentially gain wealth. And so when you're seen as a young person that has things that, again, are quite normal, but will be seen as shows of wealth, like having a lavish lifestyle or cars or laptops or iPhones, very often people who have these shows of wealth or of material wealth are seen as being potential fraudsters, which is why they are targeted by SARS in Nigeria. So just to help people understand, what does this mean in the Nigerian context? And so with the help of the Feminist Coalition, thousands of people protested and raised funds for the movement against police brutality. So the Feminist Coalition is a group that was formed in 2020, not because of SARS. They were actually formed in order to combat gender inequality in social, economic, and political life in Nigeria. And so it just happened to be the case that when they had been newly formed, that the EndSARS movements had gained a lot of traction, and they sought to help out, given that even as this particular movement about anti-ageism, and also cross-cuts with gender inequality in political, social, and economic life in Nigeria. So the Feminist Coalition was very much instrumental in helping to raise funds for the movement. And a lot of those funds were used to bail out protesters who were unlawfully arrested or those who needed medical assistance when they were injured during the protests. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the background of BLM because I assume that most people in this room have some sense of BLM's origin. However, I wanted to give a sense of how Black feminism as sort of a political space or even a political ideology permeates the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to summarize this idea by using this quote from a political theorist named Diva Woodley, who has worked specifically regarding Black feminism and the Black Lives Matter movement. And she talks about this notion of intersectionality and how it's very much palpable through the Black Lives Matter movement, and how Black women's personal politics has actually informed this larger sort of cross-cutting movement as well. So I'll just read it out for those who are not good at listening while also reading what's on the slide. So Diva Woodley says, Black women's situation at the juncture of interlocked oppressions has given rise to a political philosophy that understands justice as a state that can arise only from confronting the lived experience as opposed to the abstract conditions of those at the margins of political, social, and economic rights, concerns, and privilege. So this whole idea of centering those who have historically been decentered, or centering those we might see as being the most underprivileged in different societies, is part and parcel of what is being argued in the Black Lives Matter movement. So within BLM, even though the greater rhetoric is around tackling anti-Black racism within the US society, there is this idea of thinking about critiquing class oppression, gender oppression, other forms of oppression as well. And so, as I mentioned, social power is very much part and parcel of this project, and also my larger project, I think it's about political behavior across different political activities. I argue here that organizers leverage social power in the form of them being embedded in politically aware and politically active communities to effectively organize protests and demand justice. And so the idea here is not just so much about being embedded in communities that are overtly politically active, but also the notion that organizers leverage their personal and professional networks in order to get support for what they were doing within these movements. And so I also argue that social power is harnessed for political dissent in the form of protests within communities where their political awareness has been developed from experiential marginalization from the state. So the notion here is that social power is important for different kinds of political behavior. However, when we think about communities that have experienced the state through very marginalizing everyday sort of experiences, we can think about that political behavior showing up in the form of political dissent, which in this case happens to be in the form of political protest. So instead of engaging in political activities that are in service to the state, is more so the case of seeing people engage in political activities that are keeping the states accountable or actually countering what the state is doing in their communities. And we see this happening in BLM and also in this case in EndSARS. And so here in this project, I think about how the personal and the political are very much intertwined. And so the notion of the personal being political is not unique to Black feminist political ideologies. However, Black feminists, particularly in the United States, have helped to popularize this notion of the personal being political, which is a very important insight that can be applied to different studies of social movements and dissent and other kinds of political behavior as well. And so this is really important as we think about how Black and African feminists theorize about world phenomenon from lived experiences and consider how intersecting identities affect such lived experiences in the world. And it's very important to really think about as well how social positioning and how these different identities are integral for understanding personal experiences as sites of political education and political action. And so there are a number of similarities between the two movements, even though BLM tackles specifically anti-Black racism in the United States, and the EndSARS movement is more so about anti-ageism within Nigerian realities. The EndSARS movement in Nigeria adopted some of the language of BLM, and not just BLM, but even other Black power movements in the US in order to further the cause of fighting police brutality and demand for societal reform. And I will show you a bit of clips from some of the different organizers and activists who are part of this, who are using languages that we might see as being reminiscent of Black power movements in the US, even before BLM. And so both movements have this significant sort of female leadership, women being very much part and parcel of the background strategies, but also being on the front lines of these protest movements. And both movements have a very much decentralized structure and have also helped to advance feminist lens for understanding police brutality and social injustice. And so EndSARS is not particularly like a feminist movement per se. However, the significant role of feminist coalition in the EndSARS movement really helped to advance understandings of police brutality and social injustice by thinking about feminism from a very broad stance, which is very much significant in the Nigerian context where feminism is still seen as a very dirty word, and also arguably in certain parts of the US as well. And so another similarity is that social power, as I've been arguing, is very much important for understanding how the key organizers were embedded in not just activist networks, but their other professional circles, which helped to facilitate their leadership in these movements. And so here I have a quote from one of the interviews that was conducted with one of the co-founders of the Feminist Coalition in Nigeria. Her name is Odunayo Awenyi. And she was talking about the origins of the Feminist Coalition and essentially how she was able to recruit different members of this Feminist Coalition. If I remember correctly, it's about 8 people, if I'm not mistaken. And so really how she was able to recruit these people was by leveraging her own personal networks and also professional networks, thinking about the professional backgrounds of these different people and how they would be very important in helping to advance what the Feminist Coalition seeks to do. And so it's very interesting too how in their own articulation of their mandates as being part of this group, they weren't just thinking about themselves as Nigerian women fighting for economic and social and political power and equality and equity, but also thinking about their own situatedness as Black women in the world and thinking about even how in a quote unquote post-colonial context like Nigeria, there are certain legacies of the colonial period that very much still shape their own sort of experiences of the nation state that is modern day Nigeria. And I thought it was very interesting how there was that articulation of Blackness, even in a country that is arguably Black, a Black nation. Just to keep going. And so you see a lot of this language around police brutality that's very similar to BLM in the EndSARS movement. A number of protesters had made this point about how using the language of BLM would actually help to gain that international awareness and people be able to see those similarities and empathize with what was happening in Nigeria. And even this whole notion of no one is free until we are all free is something that for those who are familiar with, again, Black power movements in the US, they were very used to hearing that kind of rhetoric, and that was also used in the EndSARS movement. And so as I was arguing prior regarding social power and how it's engendered to different communities, even amongst the activists in the BLM movement in the US, those who had formed BLM, like Alicia Garza and the others as well, they had talked about how they had met at different gatherings, some that were inherently political, like political gatherings, and also others that weren't. It was just this whole notion of, oh, I'm going to reach out to a friend who I know is a dedicated organizer running in other spaces, whether it's for immigration justice or for other forms of social justice. There was this whole notion of really leveraging those social networks in order to build the space that was needed to push the movement forward. And I'm just going to check the chat to make sure I am good on time. Okay, 4 minutes, I see that. Okay, sorry, the chat doesn't show up automatically because I have the screen up, too much going on my slides, so sorry about that. I'm going to close this so it doesn't block me. Okay, 4 minutes. Okay, there we go. And so part of what I argue in the paper is that social networks are not just built across space, but also across time. And so really thinking critically about how this generation of activists and protesters and organizers really build upon a tradition that happened even pre-BLM, thinking about the radical feminist tradition that emerged in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and thinking about how this notion of the personal being political and even this notion of intersectionality, even though it's popularized now in our contemporary period, has already started decades before by Black feminist scholars who had already documented these. And so in the interest of time, I'll go quickly through the key differences, and people have questions about that, I can expand on a few things. So key differences between the two movements. One of them is regarding the articulations of police funding based on variations in budget allocations and insecurity issues. So whereas in the US, there was a push for defunding the police and in some spaces actually abolishing the police altogether and prisons altogether. In Nigeria, a lot of the protesters were calling for an increased police funding as an avenue to reduce corruption and reduce these human rights abuses. And as I alluded to earlier, the focus or targeted groups were quite different. In the US, is focused on anti-racism, whereas in Nigeria is more so focused on anti-ageism, again, beyond police brutality, but really thinking about the broader governmental system, political, economic, and social systems. And an implication of a kind of study of this sort is really that it opens up possibilities for further theoretical and empirical research on a variety of political behaviors across time and space, and not just focusing specifically on protests that are more visible, but thinking about the sort of hidden or more invisible forms of political expression that are happening in diverse communities. And so in this particular work and in my broader work, I think about forms of political expression that might be considered non-conventional in conventional political science literature, but are actually very much conventional and contextually relevant in the context that I care about. And so examples of some of these understudied contextually relevant behaviors are these ideas of evoking the supernatural in order to access power, the use of art and political activism and song and dance, and even the use of social media in the contemporary period. And so I will end it there in the interest of time, and I hope I was on time. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions or comments.
Not only was the presentation fantastic and rich, but it was on time too. So we really do appreciate that. Okay, so I'll field questions. Feel free to hop in if you're able to do so and just ask your own question, or if not, drop your questions in the Q&A box. And we'll take Jean's question first.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela, for this really rich presentation. It's really, I was taking lots of notes. So I just had a quick clarification question. So you mentioned that one of the distinctions between Black Lives Matter and EndSARS was sort of kind of different sort of questions or claims of the police. And so I'm wondering, can you say a little bit about the context of policing in Nigeria that would that it would help explain why protesters in Nigeria want more funding for the police? Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much for that question, Jeannie. And that's actually a really good question because I really breezed through it very quickly. So just to make sure I'm being very accurate about this, I'm not saying it's like the overarching sort of demand. It's more so based on secondary sources regarding like what were the key demands that are coming out of the protests towards the government. And one of the demands was increased police funding. I'm not sure if there's a consensus amongst all the protesters as to where this is actually the desire or the direction they want to go in, but a good number of them were expressing this. And a lot of the official sort of reports regarding this were about increased police funding. And so to understand the context in Nigeria, so the idea here is that a lot of the police or those who work in the armed forces or security forces are very much underfunded and sometimes are not even being paid at all. And so this is not just significant, this is not just unique to the security or armed forces, but also in other sectors like education. A lot of times university students will miss months or years of school and have to graduate late because teachers are on strike. Why? Because they're not being paid. So this whole notion of people not being paid adequately is very much pervasive in sort of like Nigerian public life, and people kind of understand that. And so in Nigeria, because there are issues around insecurity, particularly regarding like terrorist activity, particularly in northern Nigeria, but also in southern Nigeria, around Boko Haram. For those who might have heard about Boko Haram, there is this notion of people trying to feel more secure with security forces, but then because they're being underfunded, there's an understanding of them being underfunded, that the idea is that they're not really going to do their job. If anything, they're more likely to abuse power and use it as they please, because security forces are people you have to deal with anyways. And so they kind of extort from people in order to make ends meet. And so it's not uncommon to hear just anybody, including myself, talk about experiences they've had with the police, just being having negative experiences and being asked to pay them off for a variety of reasons, even if you're completely innocent, is a very common occurrence. And even for myself, when I was a child in Nigeria, I had certain experiences with the police as well, and my dad trying to navigate a number of things. So this is very much prevalent in the minds of Nigerians. And the idea is that, oh, if people were actually being paid well, maybe they would actually do their jobs. So I think that coupled with this whole idea within the political consciousness around there being so much insecurity and the government not being able to really tackle it or quell Boko Haram is this idea of like, oh, we need to actually put more funding or supports behind it. So that's kind of what it's explaining why the funding articulation is quite different in this context.
So it seems there, sorry, just to quickly circle back. Thank you for that response. So it seems in that case that sort of the police have sort of more legitimacy in the Nigerian context to solve the issues that you identified.
I wanted to say yes and no, which is a very academic answer to give.
Yeah.
Yes and no, but leaning a little bit more to the no. So not so much that they have
okay.
But this whole idea of what are the alternatives for safety.
I see.
Yeah, and so the idea is like, because they're underfunded, they don't have as much legitimacy because they're not doing what they're supposed to do because they're doing other things. And if anything, it's very interesting how organizers are also thinking about the notion of how the police unit was even set up to begin with, this idea that's a relic of the colonial period, and how initially when it was set up, it was to protect sort of like the colonizers and to quell any anti-colonial uprisings. For those who have a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding of history, think about it in that way. In terms of the police unit, wasn't really set up to really protect us. But even in the modern day, it's like, okay, this is the option that we have, but they're also not doing their jobs well because they don't have the support that they need to do their jobs well. So there's a lot of complicated ideas going on there, but it's really around the history of security forces in Nigeria, plus the contemporary realities around insecurity.
Thank you. That was super helpful.
Thank you.
Pamela, you mentioned briefly in your talk about the antagonism that Black feminist movements experience in the Nigerian context, and I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit more for us about in what kinds of spaces that shows up, and how differently or similarly here in the U.S. Because it is such a important and undergirding aspect of any movement, liberation movement. And I'm just interested, especially how, in this digital age, what might be accelerating or supporting those spaces and, differently now due to the, social media and what have you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question, Karita. So it's interesting that the Feminist Coalition decided to call themselves the Feminist Coalition. They could have had a different label like Women's Empowerment this, or Gender Equality that, or just something else a little bit more palatable. But even making the choice of calling themselves the Feminist Coalition, I saw that as a very bold step. Particularly in a context where feminism is seen as labeled as quite contentious for a variety of reasons. One of them being for more obvious reasons of people trying to just keep sustaining the patriarchal order, but also other reasons related to accusations of some of those pushing for equity or equality kind of borrowing Western terms and how those terms may or may not fit the context. So there are a lot of different reasons why it's actually a contentious term. And so for those who have a very good understanding of what feminism means or should mean, it might not be seen as particularly contentious, but it is. And so I thought it was very interesting that even by using a very overtly contentious term in Nigerian context, they were still very much part of this EndSARS movement. It's about anti-police brutality. Nobody had any issues with them raising funds for this movement, despite the fact that they were calling themselves feminists. And so in the Nigerian context, usually women and power is a contentious topic, but even using the term feminism is even more contentious. And so in my broader work that looks at political behavior more broadly and the gender lens, I look at how women's seeming economic empowerment by virtue of being involved in the economy is not really translating into political leadership, and how there are high costs to women running for elected office in particular, and other costs as well. But when it comes to the women I've interviewed myself and those I've just spent time with, and even survey data I've collected, a lot of women will talk about the costs of running for office, the financial costs, and of course the social costs. But a lot of these social costs were gendered. This whole notion of even engaging in political ambition or showing political ambition or expressing political ambition is seen as a very masculine trait, and it's kind of seen as upending a particular patriarchal order. And so even for a number of these women, they wouldn't even call themselves feminists. Sometimes they would be called feminists as a way of sort of shaming them or insulting them, even if it's women who never call themselves that, who are actually quite far away from that in terms of their own articulation of their own political identities. If you kind of express any form of trying to support women or try to make the scales somewhat balanced, very often there were accusations of being feminist, which is seen as a dirty word. So these are not like my own personal opinions, it's based on the data I've collected. And so beyond just protest movements, feminism itself is still quite contentious in the Nigerian context and more broadly in the African context, as we see just different waves of ideas around tolerance in different countries. And so this is not unique to the African context, of course, because even in the US context, we think about this idea of feminism and this whole thing of challenging intersectional oppressions as being, again, very contentious, because you're still upending certain legacies too. And even, again, the other sort of pushback against feminism to an extent that's from an articulation of, does this actually fit our context? Even the whole idea of Black feminism, African feminism, or some might even say womanism, are sort of ways of trying to really critique whether feminism actually fits what people are really trying to do, what kind of political work they want to do in their community. So yeah, that's a fairly long-winded answer, but it's a deep question. So I had to give at least a semi-deep answer. So thank you for the question.
Okay, so we have a question from Boniface. So in Sweden, security forces are racist because the government allows them to abuse their power, but in Nigeria, they mistreat people for not having funds. Are there places where the SARS is perceived as helping the community?
Ooh. Okay, thank you for that comment and question, Boniface. It's a very good question. I don't know if there are spaces where SARS is seen as helping the community. I have not encountered that, both personally and in my research, to be honest. There might be spaces where that is happening. I will say this, SARS is, again, a special unit within the police, so it's not representing the whole police unit, but part of the demands from the protesters and the activists who are involved with EndSARS was really using this sort of traction to make a commentary about the governance system overall and how there's just so much corruption, how there's systemic marginalization of young people, of women, of people of certain ethnicities and other backgrounds. And so in certain communities, particularly in communities that have been ravaged by some of the atrocities committed by terrorist groups like Boko Haram or other terrorist groups, perhaps there might be a positive look on it if they've seen SARS as being effective. But again, because people see them as not being, one, the most effective, and two, quite abusive of their power because there's so much underfunding and so much underappreciation of this unit, I don't know if people will see them as being supportive, given that they're not really seen as being effective. And if anything, they're seen as being effective in committing crimes that they're supposed to help to combat. So yeah, the shorter answer is I do not know if that exists, but perhaps it does.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Last round for questions for Pamela. Well, Pamela, thank you so much. Boniface has one more question. Can you hop in, Boniface?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes,
All right, great. For some reasons, my camera is not working, but I'm trying to connect the two problems that, I mean, the feminist consideration and at the same time the police, the EndSARS, because I've been in Cameroon for some time, and so the special forces there, actually police officers would rent or lend their guns for people, for criminals who are already in jail or in cells under custody to go and commit acts after the community and bring, and they can share the money. And so the Boko Haram and everything else in the northern part of the Cameroon is also prevalent, as Pamela can testify, is that whole region that is kind of in turmoil because of all of that. So my question here is, are there examples where the community is trying to have a dialogue with the police? Are there situations where the leaders of EndSARS would go and say, hey, the police unit here is very corrupt, they are mistreating us, and let us have a conversation, right? Because you could be on the street all day long, every day long, they would send cannons and water and all the things to you. But is there any dialogue happening between the leaders of the movement and the police itself beyond the SARS community and forces?
Okay, thank you for expanding the question a little bit more. So this is interesting. I think this would be an interesting line of questioning as I move forward in the project. I'm thinking of expanding this into a potential book project in the future. It's in the future because I still have my dissertation I have to make into a book project. So down the line, we'll see. Time, what is that? So a lot of the grievances against SARS were articulated through sort of like the federal government. And so I think we'll see more of these kinds of conversations between the security forces and local communities if articulations around security forces were quite local. And so if we look more so at local security forces or local police or even just other kinds of security forces, I think that's more likely. But because in this particular case, it was more so of units that is kind of federally established, it wasn't as localized in that space. I personally would be very curious to even see what kinds of conversations would come out of that. I haven't encountered that. I know, like, even in the US context, there are certain communities that have tried to have that dialogue between the local police force and also the communities that have been grieved by what has been happening by the police, just trying to have some sort of, I don't even know what I'll call it, communal healing, transitional justice, some type of conversation, and see if there's like a way to even have those conversations. So I've seen that in the US context, but I haven't actually encountered that in the Nigerian context. But I will say, I wouldn't say that I haven't encountered it because it does not exist. I would say I haven't encountered it because I haven't sought it out. So let's put it that way. So I think it's more so another line of questioning that I could pursue, but I would be curious to see if that's more likely if people are thinking about the police through a local lens as opposed to through a federal government kind of lens. I think that would be more likely in that space. But thank you very much for expanding on that question and even connecting it to Cameroon as well.
Thank you. Okay, well, this concludes your presentation, Pamela, but it also surprisingly is going to conclude the session and our panel, our panoply of papers for the day. We did have one more presentation scheduled for today. However, our presenter is not able to join us and share their presentation. So we will move on to our discussion period now. So how we're going to do this is, there's been so much offered today and throughout the papers. So we're going to have some concluding remarks presented by Jean, and then we'll just open it up for a discussion to kind of just see where people are landing on the multiple conversations that we've had today.
Great. Thank you so much, Karita. And thanks to everyone who participated and presented today. I learned so much and have a lot of sort of thoughts and questions, and just was jotting out a lot of kind of themes throughout the day or morning for me in California. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of make some general reflections and some common themes, and kind of open it up after that. And this is just kind of based on some notes I was taking throughout the morning or throughout the day. So first is just the general question of the significance of Black Lives Matter outside of the United States. And I think obviously that's a very broad question that we've tackled in different ways throughout the day. But I also think it's interesting to think about like why Black Lives Matter specifically is having this resonance. And I think I'll come back to that. And then, so another way of thinking about that is the kind of question of temporality or time. Like, so why now? I think when we think about the sort of post George Floyd moment, if you will, we can think about it. Some people have already mentioned the relevance of the COVID-19 pandemic, which, in some way or another forced us to slow down and maybe pay attention to things that are happening that we wouldn't otherwise. As Yasmin mentioned, for example, anti-Black violence in Sweden is not to start with 2020, right? So like, what is the sort of how should we think about the sort of specifics of the 2020 moment? Another theme I wanted to bring forth is just the way that Black Lives Matter is dismissed as a U.S. phenomenon. So thinking about these different modes of dismissal, both in terms of geography or spatial, so racism or anti-Blackness or police violence against Black populations is a U.S. phenomena, and not one that is at all relevant outside of the U.S. And how different actors in different societies use that discourse to dismiss the claims of folks, primarily racialized minorities within their own societies, against the sort of local forms of anti-Blackness, of police violence, of state violence, et cetera. Third is thinking about kind of the overall role of nation state ideologies. So, and both in terms of shaping the discourse of what is race, what is racism, what can even be named literally and figuratively as both, what can even be discussed in any sort of public sphere, and then also thinking about the role of nation state ideologies and sort of how different actors, how different activists mobilize against or think about mobilizing against this racism. So, as someone who does research in France, I'm always thinking that's always my go-to non-US example, but, thinking about in the case of France, as Philippe addressed earlier in his presentation, of the role of the discourse or the ideology of French republicanism that, among other things, sees all individuals as equal, and how that sort of disavows the ability to even name, like literally name the word racism or race, and how that sort of structures the kind of activist work that racialized minorities have to do, or feel compelled to do in the French context. And I think we can say something very similar about the Nordic context as well. And so related to that, I was also thinking about the question of state ideology in and of itself. And I think this gets into questions of democracy, like in China, for example, but also this sort of overarching ideologies of colorblindness, which very, very prevalent in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, but also as a way of thinking about what can actually be named or termed or acknowledged, and the kind of work that people have to do to acknowledge what can't be acknowledged, as silly as that sounds. Okay, so the fourth point I want to make, and then now I have to kind of read my scribbled handwriting, is also kind of thinking about the sort of the organizational dynamics of some of these what we might term Black Lives Matter kinds of organizations or collectives. It just struck me throughout the day that sometimes we were talking about, formal networks of folks. Sometimes we were talking about sort of more, organic collectives that arise after, X incident of police violence, as again the case in the French context, or they're sort of, codified or recognized organizations. So as another way to think about kind of how this this anti-racist activism is operating. The fifth point, I think I'm on number 5, is the theme of sort of counter protests and movements. So again, I think this came up earlier today. Black Lives Matter having this sort of the counter movement, if you will, in the United States of like Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or these kinds of things. And thinking about kind of what form that takes in different societies is another way to think about the overall resonance of Black Lives Matter as a social movement. And then also, make 2 more points, I think. Next point, next theme I wanted to kind of highlight is also thinking about the sort of complications or the nuances of transnational solidarities more generally. So I was thinking about that specifically with the Black and Palestinian solidarity paper, but I think there's solidarities around Black populations and X society versus Y society. And I think as I tried to mention earlier in one of my questions, thinking about, the ways that Blackness is codified or not in different societies and the implications that has for how people can, see any kind of resonance with the Black Lives Matter movement. And then finally, 2 more points. Sorry. One point is also a theme is the sort of role of the media, both the sort of national media, the news media, and then also social media. That's something that also came up a lot through our discussion today. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion around sort of our implicit discussion around sort of the social construction of race, but I also thought it was interesting to think about the social construction of national histories, right? And so I think, again, to Yasmin's presentation, thinking about the way that Sweden sees itself as not having a colonial history, right? And how like that's a deliberative project to, among other things, say that racism is a problem elsewhere, but in the Nordic countries, to give one example. But I think this sort of social construction of like, national myths, national histories is really instructive for thinking about this resonance as well. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts. So people can either, unmute themselves if they're on the panelist, but if they want to put a question in the Q&A. Oh, okay, Monica, I will allow you to speak. Okay, you should be able to.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, everyone. And it has been a great day. I mean, there's no reason to complain about all the presentations. I think I learned more today than the past 2 or 3 years about the Black Lives Movement. And so thank you everyone participated. Thank you to the organizers. And I have 2 or 3 comments. One is about, all my comments are about how I understood things and how things came to my mind. The first thing is I didn't know that there was a movement in France studying the impact of Black Lives Movement. I have friends who are studying racism and other things in France, but I discovered that there is new venues. There are other venues where I can try to reach out and understand better what's happening in France, considering the Black Lives, the BLM, and other things. The second thing is the Chinese perception or how the Black Lives Movement is perceived by Chinese. And here I have a question. I don't know if I understood it well, or please help me clarify my understanding. Were you saying at some point that most of the people who reacted on Twitter, on all the social media, were actually activists who are outside of China and trying to react to the fact that the BLM movement is not what it should be, because you said something about 80% of the people who you collected the data on were saying, no, we don't want the BLM. And so, was that what you said? If it isn't the case, what would be one of the reasons behind that? Because usually people who are oppressed with the Black Palestinian movement, all things, oppressed people tend to gather together to find a solution. So if the Chinese who are outside of the country are the ones being against BLM movement, what would be one of the reasons? That's a curiosity question and understanding of my part. The third point I would like to share is about Jasmine's presentation. I wasn't surprised about the racism in Sweden because, again, personal experience, I have friends who live there, and I visited sometimes in the past 3 years, and it seems to be like they're complaining every day. But my surprise is more of the Roma community. Is there any connection with the Roma community in Sweden with the Roma community in the US? Because there were, I mean, I read 2 or 3 years ago, maybe actually 5 years ago, that there's a resettlement of Roma from Europe in general in the US. Is there any connection between the two, and how are they fighting, or are they organizing against racism and all the discrimination, if I can put it that way? And then my last comment is about what Pamela was saying about how the term feminist is viewed on the continent. Right? I'm going to generalize because there are a lot of places on the continent where if you say I'm feminist, people look at you like, what do you mean? Are you against men? Right. So is there any, at the academic level, is there any movement or kind of push for people on the continent to say, no, the word feminist doesn't mean against men? Is there anything going on like that that you can say that people are trying to clarify? That's all I have.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, in the interest of time, we want to kind of keep the discussion brief. So I don't know who wants to speak to those points.
I can actually respond. So yeah, so this is actually where the surprise is, as you point out. You know, those most active people who are on Twitter are actually political exiles. They were oppressed by the Chinese government. That's the reason they actually fled to the United States. And then, you know, we would imagine those people should be allies of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So then, you know, being oppressed by the state and by the police. But as we already revealed, the logic is that they believe that the Black Lives Matter movement or the Marxist movement, and Marxism is the dominant ideology of the Chinese state. And there should be some connection between the two. That's their sort of a narrative. And that narrative actually is extended even further to the Democratic Party, Antifa, and things like that. So all these people were connected together in the narrative pattern. So you can see if you use the political spectrum where they are, that's actually on the ultra right. So it's not really entirely surprising if you know other ethnic groups and particularly refugees and immigrants politics. For example, Cuban immigrants to the United States, and you find similar things there. Many of the people are on the ultra right side. So this is surprising because that's the case. One is about China, which is less discussed here. Second is about a race-related issue. So that's a very brief answer to your question.
I don't know if any other panelists want to weigh in on any of that or any other sort of concluding thoughts or reflections.
Well, I can just briefly say that, well, there is a lot of, I mean, the Roma situation is also very different across Europe in different contexts, because there are different histories, different histories of state violence, although the consistency is the history of state violence and persecution of Roma people in Europe. But it looks, even within the Nordic context, for example, it looks a bit different in Finland versus Sweden and elsewhere. But I would say, kind of speaking for Finland and Sweden, that there is a long history of Roma organizing around policing and racial profiling. And as I mentioned, you know, there is this example of it coming out that the Swedish police was very explicitly, even though they not supposed to collect any data on race or ethnicity, right, keeping registries of Roma people. And so there's a longer standing history of activism around policing, I think, in the Roma community than there is in other communities. They're also recognized national minorities in both Finland and Sweden. And so they have a particularly protected, constitutionally protected legal status, which does not extend to people of African descent. In terms of whether how that's connected to US engagement, I'm sure, you know, at the EU level or in other contexts that there is sort of engagement across the two contexts, but I don't know that in terms of the community struggles I'm aware of tend to be very localized, and engaging with the local histories and local conditions, and are not necessarily tying things into what's happening with Roma folks in the US. But again, maybe at the EU level, there might be more information on that if you're interested.
So thank you for that. So, you know, I just kind of gave some concluding thoughts of sort of my reflections of the presentations thus far. So I would love to hear anyone else with responses to those or other themes they think we should bring before the kind of animate of the day as well. So just to say, we should be prescribed by what I laid out.
Yeah. Basically, I tried to repeat some of your thoughts, but you know, in that's what academic
probably more eloquently,
about.
than I did. Yeah.
One of the thoughts I think I tried to reiterate, also sort of a you know, it's the draw from what you have said is the concept of race, which is we always say like a race is socially constructed. And when we in all the presentations, we find that the fundamental issue is that how is race defined, or even more primitive question is that is race a concept in the context that we talked about? If it is not, and then it was something else, or how is race related to other issues like skin color, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So that symbolic sort of aspect is something that we need to start to think about the issues that we need to, it's not our sort of definitions, but the definitions in the context we examine. And then we can actually have a more global perspective of comparing all these, which is not to say like racism does not exist, racial problems does not exist. In China case, you know, race is considered as a foreign issue, but racism is definitely there, right? But so that was the one of the cases. So I would say like a comparative perspective on the terms, on the classification system, is quite important for us to incorporate into our studies.
Yeah, Yasmin, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, I'll maybe jump in on that briefly, and then I wanted to kind of reflect back a couple of things you mentioned. So I mean, first of all, I really appreciate your articulation of the kind of the themes as you see them. They, you know, they really reflect kind of what I think I've been observing across contexts as well. And so I'm happy to see that kind of resonating across the board. I think this question of the comparative perspective on terminology and on classification, I think also speaks to one of the points that Jane brought up around national histories, and not just the kind of manufacturing of national histories, but really like taking seriously those national histories, right? Because I think this is a tension sometimes, I think, in doing work on race and racism elsewhere, right? Like I see scholars, for example, talking about Europe and saying, well, we can't really use, like, people here don't use this terminology. So it's like, because the people don't use it in their everyday lexicon, like it's not like relevant, right? Then it becomes a US importation if we use it. But again, for example, in the case of Sweden, well, I mean, you literally were a really big part of creating the racial classification system that has then circulated around the world. So it's not the case that it's not in the local lexicon, right? It's not currently, according to sort of the current status quo, because of post-World War II reformulations of humanism and what it means to be liberal, and sort of attempts to erase particular histories, right? It's not currently part of the everyday language that people use, but that doesn't mean that it's foreign to the context, right? Or that it hasn't informed, aspects of national identity and social structures and so forth. And so I'm interested in like how are kind of taking seriously the national histories, and also the global histories, right, of race in terms of colonialism, how we can take that into account when we're thinking about the tensions and how we're talking about or not talking about race today, right? And that, of course, it's not to say that it's all this, again, it's not the same everywhere. There are those nuances and those differences, but it's also not a modern question. And I think it always needs to be historicized and thought about critically. Another couple things that, Jean, that your kind of thematic breakdown made me think of a lot, and I wonder if anybody else has thoughts on this in terms of thinking about the complications or nuances of transnational solidarities. I've been thinking a lot about also the question of kind of intranational tensions and comparative racisms and competing movements, competing narratives, right? And how this ends up also impacting what the movement looks like, how it takes form in different contexts. Because again, there's the way, like, for example, we could talk about the way that Turkish Germans, right, might adopt and use this as a framework for talking about their struggles, but there's also Afro-German struggles, which have a different relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement, right, than their maybe Turkish counterparts, right? So it can get complicated, and it can get, and I think even within, as we talked about as well, even within sort of broadly Black or African, Afro-descended communities, there's also tensions and nuances in terms of how we might relate politically to Blackness, to this issue, to struggles, class differences, national ethnic differences. Like there's lots, I think, of kind of nuance, I think, to further examine also within different national contexts. That is something that, I'm curious to see kind of where the conversation continues going. And related to this, perhaps another thing that I was also thinking a lot about is how these local contexts and local kind of ecologies of anti-racism end up impacting how BLM has landed and how it's used. And Pamela, for example, brought this up, I think, a lot, or highlighted this in a really great way. But I'm also thinking again about like, what have the sort of palatable or the mainstream anti-racist movements looked like, what have the discourses looked like, is going to end up impacting how BLM makes it in. And related to that, it's also then going to impact which types of things end up either enabling or inhibiting sustained engagement with the movement and its kind of orienting logics or demands, right? Whether that means kind of how it can get co-opted by the state or co-opted by a sort of mainstream anti-racism that maybe wants to make it more palatable and less extreme, or wants to refocus the attention on other questions, whether it's the repression of the movements in different contexts. So I think that again, this national histories part, like both the transnational and the kind of local, I think there's so much I'm really interested in continuing to unpack. And I'm also curious for those of you all working in other contexts, whether these questions of the sort of the local landscape in terms of racial tensions or sort of comparative community relations, or the kind of local ecologies of anti-racism, how you see that having kind of impacted how BLM has landed. So those are some thoughts and some things I'm hoping to talk with y'all about in the future.
Thank you, Yasmin. Pamela, and then maybe I'll jump back in. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to echo what Yasmin was saying regarding just how Jean skillfully really just tied all the threads for the different presentations. I want to affirm that because I know it's not easy to do. So thank you very much for that breakdown and the summary and just like seeing all the themes through all the different presentations. One of the joys for me of sharing intellectual space with sociologists is that you all are really good at questioning a thing, questioning a label, and really questioning what is the work this label is doing. And I really appreciate that as somebody from a political science background. Though most of the spaces where I thrive intellectually are usually the more interdisciplinary spaces anyway. And so it's really this conversation, just thinking about BLM across different contexts, and even just this whole notion of what labels are we using, how are we thinking about people's political identities, even if they're not using these labels that we might use in academia. And so it's really making me think, what is the political work that's being done when we choose to use certain labels over others? And even our own sort of like just political convictions around being academics and thinking about how the way we record a thing, the way we disseminate a thing also shapes the discourse around that thing too, right? Because academia is not removed from the real world. And so it's really making me think about just like activists of the past and even of the present moment, thinking about what's really infiltrating the general public political consciousness and how what is recorded, what is shared is what tends to shape how people even articulate their own political identities. And I think Yasmin did a great job about mentioning how even for certain folks who might not think of a particular issue, say racism, as being politically salient, maybe in Europe, for instance, that you still see these conversations taking place. They might call it something else, they might articulate in different ways, but then you still see it happening. And I think as scholars studying these different contexts and these particular issues, we sort of have our own kind of obligation to be very careful about how we think about how these labels are used and what kind of labels we use to describe what's happening or these different phenomenon. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm taking away from this space. I already sort of had that within my own socialization as a scholar, but I think just sharing space with you all today has really just reminded me and affirmed that, okay, I'm on the right path of being very careful about what my role is as a scholar, really documenting history, documenting reality through certain lenses. So yeah, I just want to say thank you. That was a roundabout way of saying thank you.
Well, thank you, Pamela. Karita, and then I can jump in.
Okay, I'm going to just offer some reflections, but I didn't write any of them down, so please forgive me for riffing. For me, this conference has been as much about the global Black Lives Matter movement as it has been about how global anti-Blackness is. And it's reminded me how important it is to center anti-Blackness as a serious matter of social theory in and of itself. Because when I think as of late in my current scholarship, I've been thinking a lot around anti-Blackness and white supremacy, presupposing that they're always these two conditions working together, which in many ways they are. However, when we root anti-Blackness historically, we know that it precedes European expansion, and it is something that can operate in and of itself, while it can be amplified, augmented, transformed by global white supremacy and the epoch of racial capitalism in which we live. It also precedes it, and in talking about Black lives, that experience living in, around, and through an anti-Black global society is something that matters a great deal. And I am walking away from this conference even more convinced and committed to the singularity of how important that is. So yes, race, yes, racism, but anti-Black racism as a singular and particular condition and thing and social force that we must understand. Even if we think we've got it, I think we still have no idea. And the range of and breadth of topics that we've gotten to discuss through these papers has only made it more apparent, because no matter what context we're in, what nation state we were focused on today, the one thing that did not escape us was the raging anti-Blackness here, there, and everywhere. Okay, so that's just that's a something that I'm going to take forever from this conference. I also want to acknowledge, because this is a conference that's put on by the Department of Sociology at Emory, that many of us are sociologists, and for those who aren't, you are cousin too, Pamela, over there with as a political scientist. It is important to name and recognize that Black Lives Matter, the hashtag, was originated by Marcus Anthony Hunter in 2012. Okay, a Black sociologist. Now, while Black Lives Matter, the movement, turned into all sorts of other things, those origin stories of what a hashtag can do, what articulating and breathing life into through word and form, this statement that should not be so controversial, should not have needed to materialize itself into a global movement for the mass assertion of humanity of Black folks. It started with a hashtag. Okay, and that's important. So I just want to put his name in this space, that Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter gave us that hashtag for a whole movement to then take on and mobilize from it. So those are the two things that I'll offer, and I really look forward to continuing these very important conversations with all of you. Yeah, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Karita, especially for getting us to the specific origins of Black Lives Matter and really being intentional about that as we think about the overall resonance of this movement and how it's spread both within the United States and globally. Just two quick points, kind of in response to some of the previous comments. So for when to come back to Ben's point about the sort of comparative, the need for comparisons of the concept of race, I just want to shout out Anne Morning and Marco Manari's latest book on Race and Ugly Word, which, I mean, they do a kind of comparative analysis of the concept of race in the United States and Italy through an analysis of communities of descent, or the notion of descent. So even getting away from the specific term race is sort of what was instrumental for them in doing that kind of comparative analysis. So just to kind of put that forth. And then I also want to just kind of also echo what Yasmin said about sort of taking national history seriously and really I think kind of using that as a start point before we even begin to kind of have these conversations about comparing society X versus Y. And so one of my sort of favorite, in quotation marks, anecdotes about that is, as it relates to the French context, surprisingly for me, is that so there's a historian, American historian of French history, Sue Peabody, who's one of her earlier books is called There Are No Slaves Here. And the reason why she came up with that title was that she was going to France and doing archival research, and people were like, oh, slavery didn't exist here, it existed in the colonies, it's not part of France. And it's very, very common, even today, frankly, for otherwise intelligent French people to say that France never had slaves. The United States had slaves. France itself never had slaves because the colonies had slaves. So just to give an example, kind of dystopic example, of just the ways that, you know, national histories are continually constructed, and how, you know, French people like legitimately believe or continue to say that slavery is not part of their history, when in fact it's just as much as part of their history as it was in the case of the United States. So just those are just two comments in response. I don't know if anyone else has any concluding thoughts, comments, reflections, questions.
If I can be a little bit fancier, so we can actually say like
Yeah.
provincializing race, although it sounds like
right.
In other words, race is
Yeah.
not a United States problem, and we hear in Sweden, in China, and it's basically the perception is that, oh, race is American problem. Actually, not. It's more like provincializing race.
Right.
Yeah.
And I in that regard, I've always found David Theo Gover's work to be really helpful in his framework of racial Europeanization, of sort of the way that race is specifically structured as elsewhere, but not any part of what is historically or contemporarily understood as Europe. So that's another example. Yeah, Yasmin, please.
Yeah, and I think also just to kind of thinking about that also, like what work does that do? Like I think one thing that is interesting about this sort of setup, I mean, it makes these conversations difficult, but one thing that I also see activists struggling with is the way that, well, we can't get to the real conversation because this kind of discursive setup, this kind of discursive regime keeps us debating the relevance of race like in infinity. And like that's all it becomes about, right? Like even the conversation can't get that deep into, for example, well, what does racialized policing look like? What do the local manifestations of anti-Blackness or, you know, police abuse look like? Because we're just talking about, well, is race relevant? Well, is racism relevant? Is it importation? Is it local? And those are important things that kind of come up again and again and again. But I think thinking a lot about sort of Cedric Robinson's kind of framings of racial regimes as well, and the way that they kind of resist exposure, right, is that it serves a purpose to kind of keep the public also debating this, and to keep activists and aggrieved communities just having to prove the relevance of the question in the first place. And I think that's also something I think for us to think about as scholars trying to engage with activists doing this work, but also in trying to understand the issues of talking about race and racism in different places.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that.
So he just joined us. So if you have anything to
say.
If
you have anything, not to put you on the spot, but if you want to share any final thoughts or concluding thoughts about the other presentations or. Please go ahead. Yeah.
So I feel I must have missed a lot of the discussion, but the last comment made me think of this formulation in psychoanalysis called fetishist disavowal, where on one hand you can say, I know very well about all these racial problems in the world, but nonetheless, I believe in America, I believe in the French Republic, I believe things can get better. So the kind of anti-racist discourse is no longer about exposing the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter has been recognized at some abstract level. It's the libidinal economy, the attachment to certain things that are very difficult to disrupt at the cognitive level. So, you know, the challenge I see of how do you make anti-racism actualizable, right, in the world is, you know, you have to go head on with the kind of collective unconscious, how people imagine the world happening, the pleasures in seeing oneself as anti-racist, right, hating the haters. You know, there's a kind of enjoyment where you forget about the actual problems of people. So how do you disrupt this libidinal economy that keeps feeding this machinery? I don't know how folks' works kind of relate to this question, if it's relevant at all.
Good, thank you very much. I think we can continue our discussions in various ways. And also, you know, this one-day conference is just very, very tiring, but at the same time, you know, it's very fruitful as well. So we'll continue our discussions in other ways, and particularly about what's the next step for this collective effort. And we'll be in touch through email. So again, since this is being recorded, so I want to acknowledge the support from the Department of Sociology at Emory and also Hoa Institute for Global Research. They actually changed the name of the grant to Global Ethnicity Plus Race Plus, which actually is very interesting the grant name, which I think they try to expand, you know, the scope, realizing that race and ethnicity still have their limits in terms of defining reality. I think that's a positive change. I think we can call it a day. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, I think we've
much.
been on Zoom for a long time, so we can kind of stop here for now. But thank you so much, everyone. And as Ben said, we will be in touch with next steps, and really appreciate all your participation and interventions. I know I learned a lot. So
Great, thanks. And we can actually stop recording.
okay.
Thank you all. Thank you to the organizers.